I mean, back it up. Okay. When you pick up an English translation of the Bible, first of all, you're picking up an English translation of the Bible. So you're not reading the original anything. And choices are being made without you knowing it constantly, right? Choices that are influenced by the translator's theological perspectives, historical, guesses, all kinds of things. Lack of knowledge, right? There are words we don't know the meaning of. Translators got to take a crack at it. There are, how does the Bible begin, man? What are the first words of the Bible in English? Hit me.
In the beginning, God.
Yeah, finish that. In the beginning,
God created the heavens and the earth.
All right, that's good enough. Right? That's how your King James Bible begins. It's good stuff. Implies that there's nothing before creating heaven and earth, right?
Right.
Creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, right? Because that's what the people who translated the King James believed. My English translation, the Jewish Publication Society version, begins when God began to create heaven and the earth. That's different. There could be stuff before creation then. And in fact, Judaism thinks that there was. So now which one of those is right and wrong? Neither. You know which one's right? The Hebrew is right. Right? But the Hebrew could go either way, right? So your translation is already an interpretation. It's not the Bible, it's a Bible, right? Like the King James is a creation out of nothing Bible, and the JPS is a not creation out of nothing Bible.
Can I probe you real quick here?
Please don't call it that.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. You said the Hebrew is right, but here's the trickier part.
Yeah, hold on. I haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
I'm gonna get there. Wait for it. Okay. So you're reading an English translation with the choices the translator has made, right? That you, as the lay reader, don't know are choices because you don't know the thing it's being translated from or what the other alternatives are. So you're being presented with a version of the text that is not necessarily the version. Right? There is no the version. There's only, every translation is just a version. Okay, so that's one problem. What text is being translated? Right? The text that's being translated for you is the Masoretic text, right? That is to say, this now relatively the form of the Hebrew that was standardized in the 11th century or so. That's the 11th century, of course, AD, right? Not the 11th century BC. So you're reading a translation of an 11th century manuscript, right? That was itself an attempt, at least in many cases, an attempt to fix the problems of all the manuscripts that had come before it, right? So before the 11th century, a whole bunch of different Hebrew manuscripts with all kinds of varying kinds of terms. And someone was like, let's get ourselves a nice, tight, clean, we'll get all the problems out. So there's decisions being made there by humans about which text is right. Virtually every English translation is based on one manuscript, right? One medieval 11th century, 1,000 years ago, 11th century manuscript. We call it the Leningrad Codex because it happens to now reside in Leningrad. That Hebrew text is one manuscript, right? It's manuscripts, not printed copies, right? This isn't the kind of thing where you run off a million copies of the same thing, so every text is the same. Every manuscript's a tiny bit different. So my English translation is of the Leningrad Codex, but if I did an English translation of a different manuscript, some stuff would be maybe a tiny bit different because every manuscript has problems or, differences. And manuscripts, being manuscripts, just have mistakes in them, right? So when you read your King James and you get to Genesis 22, which is the sacrifice of Isaac, near sacrifice of Isaac, and Abraham has lifted his knife to slay his son, and the angel stops him and says, don't do it. And Abraham at that point lifts his eyes and he sees a ram. In the King James, he sees a ram behind him. Right? It's a little bit weird. He sees a ram behind him. Right? He lifted his eyes and saw a ram. It's weird. But that's because the King James is doing a literal translation of this Leningrad Codex, which has a typo right there. It's not a ram behind him. It's a ram, right? In Hebrew, this is the difference of like a tiny little tick of a line between the word achar, behind, and the word achad, one, right? That's all. It's just a typo, right? It's like in English, I don't even know. It's like we don't even have letters that are even this close. It's like mistaking an O for a U. It's like mistaking a capital I for an L if you're not using, like they're nearly identical letters, right? The Leningrad Codex has a typo there. Instead of he lifted his eyes and he saw a ram, it says he lifted his eyes and he saw a ram behind. The King James says behind. But it's a mistake. It's a mistake in that one manuscript.
Right.
My Jewish Publication Society version says a ram. It doesn't say behind because they know about the mistake, 500 years later or 400 years after the King James, like they figured it out, like we all knew about it. And so they fixed it because they recognized it was just an error. So who's reading the Bible, right? Your Bible's got a typo in it, man. Like, and mine doesn't, kind of. But like, also the Hebrew text that yours is translating had a typo in it. And other Hebrew texts from that period don't. And then what do we do about the fact that the 11th century manuscript that we're looking at is from the 11th century? Like it's 1,000 years old. I got manuscripts that are 2,000 years old. Shouldn't they be worth more? We call those the Dead Sea Scrolls. But which manuscript am I supposed to be like? Am I supposed to just be reading the Dead Sea Scrolls? Is that like the real text? Like it's different in all kinds of ways. Not only is the Dead Sea Scrolls text different from our current Hebrew text, but the Dead Sea Scrolls sometimes preserved multiple versions of the same Hebrew text. So, for example, I could find a text of the Book of Samuel from the Dead Sea Scrolls that looks a lot like the Book of Samuel that is in my Bible today. But I can also find from the Dead Sea Scrolls a Book of Samuel that's pretty different from my current Hebrew Bible. They're both 2,000 years old. Which one of them is the right one? And what happens when I tell you that the one that doesn't look like my current Hebrew text looks a lot like the 3rd century BC Greek translation of the Bible? Because the oldest text we have, not in manuscript, but the Greek translation, the Septuagint, is from the 3rd century BC, before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I don't have a manuscript of it from then, but that's when that translation happened. Since the Septuagint isn't the same as the Hebrew, that is the Greek and the Hebrew, the Greek seemed to be translating a different version of the Hebrew than the Hebrew I have now. Should I give more credit to the Greek than to the Hebrew? Sometimes. What if I really like the book of Jeremiah as I'm reading it in my Hebrew right now? Too bad the Septuagint, the Greek version, is like a 1/6 shorter. There's got all sorts of stuff in the Hebrew that's not in the Greek.
Right.
Like, which one is the Bible? Is it the longer version of Jeremiah or the shorter version? Right? They both got claims to antiquity. The Septuagint Greek may have a better claim. I don't know, maybe not. Like, what about the two versions of Samuel? They're both equally attested at Qumran, right, at the Dead Sea community, which means those people thought that both were good. Which one's the Bible? Like they're kind of both the Bible. Point is, when you pick up a Bible in like the pews or at home or whatever, your English version of the Bible, when you pick up the King James, you're reading, in the case of the King James, reading a 17th century translation of an 11th century manuscript of a text that was not stable even 1,000 years before that. Like, choices are being made all the way through here. And of course, that's not even to get into, and I should have, the question of like, translations are based not just on the text, but on you have to know how Hebrew works, right? Hebrew is consonants and vowels, like English, except the vowels aren't written down, usually. So, if you're basing your translation on the way that somebody has put vowels into the text, that was a choice that was made, 1,000 years ago, but doesn't tell me anything about what they meant 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago when it was written, right? There's all sorts of human intervention happening along the way as people are collating manuscripts and putting vowels into manuscripts and translating them and selecting them and transcribing them and making typos and, choosing which ones they prefer. I don't know which one the Bible really is.